Beneath history's shadow lies a gospel the world was never meant to see. The forbidden Gospel of Judas reveals a truth so shocking that the Vatican tried to erase it. What secrets did Judas hold knowledge too dangerous, too sacred, or too powerful to survive? The manuscript survived. Are you ready to uncover what they tried to bury? For almost 2,000 years, his was the name that embodied the ultimate betrayal. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, whose kiss marked Jesus for death, whose name became synonymous with treachery itself. This is the story as it has been told, retold, and burned into the Western consciousness for millennia. But beneath the sands of Egypt, a different voice waited to be heard. A voice silenced by the early church, condemned as blasphemy, and believed destroyed forever. Until one day in 1978, near the caves of Al-Minya in Middle Egypt, when local farmers stumbled upon a sealed limestone box. Inside lay a small leather-bound codex, its pages blackened with age, written in Coptic script. They could not read the ancient text, could not know they had discovered one of the most controversial documents in Christian history. For decades, this fragile manuscript traveled a dangerous path through the shadowy world of antiquities dealers. Its pages deteriorated in bank vaults and neglected storage units as it changed hands from one collector to another. Few understood what they possessed, a text that would challenge 2 millennia of Christian orthodoxy. When I first saw the manuscript, I immediately recognized its significance. The title was clear, The Gospel of Judas. I knew then we were dealing with something extraordinary. In 2004, National Geographic assembled a team of the world's leading scholars to authenticate, preserve, and translate the ancient document. What they discovered was explosive. This was not merely a new text about Judas. It was a gospel supposedly written by Judas himself, presenting a radically different account of the events leading to the crucifixion. To understand this gospel's significance, we must journey back to the 2nd century, when Christianity was not yet a unified religion, but a diverse tapestry of competing beliefs. Among these early Christian groups were the Gnostics, mystics who believed salvation came through secret knowledge, or gnosis, rather than faith alone. It was within these circles that the Gospel of Judas found its audience. The Gospel begins with a shocking claim, the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week 3 days before he celebrated Passover. Unlike the canonical Gospels, this text portrays Judas not as a traitor, but as Jesus' closest disciple, the only one who truly understood Christ's divine mission. Where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John condemned Judas as betrayer, this gospel elevates him as hero. What makes this text so subversive is its complete inversion of the traditional narrative. Here, Judas doesn't betray Jesus out of greed, or because he was possessed by Satan. Instead, Jesus specifically asks Judas to turn him over to the authorities. It's presented as an act of obedience, not betrayal. You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. With these words, Jesus allegedly tells Judas that by handing him over, Judas will help free Christ's divine spirit from its human body, a necessary sacrifice for salvation to be possible. Far from being demonized, Judas is portrayed as the most enlightened of the disciples, the only one to whom Jesus entrusted his deepest mysteries. This revelation shook the foundations of the traditional narrative. What if the greatest villain in Christian history had been miscast? What if Judas's actions were not a betrayal, but a divinely ordained necessity? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what if the church had deliberately suppressed this alternative story? The existence of the Gospel of Judas was not unknown to early church leaders. Around 180 CE, Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon explicitly condemned it in his work Against Heresies, writing, "They produce a fictitious history which they style the Gospel of Judas." Irenaeus's mention proves the text existed in the 2nd century. But after his condemnation, the Gospel of Judas vanished from history, presumably destroyed in the systematic purging of non-canonical texts as the Church solidified its power and defined its orthodox doctrine. For 17 centuries, the voice of Judas remained silenced, his gospel lost to time, until that chance discovery in the Egyptian desert resurrected a narrative that the early church had tried desperately to erase. What's remarkable isn't just what the gospel says, but what its existence tells us about early Christianity. This wasn't a monolithic religion from the beginning. There were diverse, competing understandings of Jesus' teachings and the meaning of his death and resurrection. The Gospel of Judas emerged from a time when the very definition of Christianity was still being contested. Before emperors and councils, standardized belief before the canon was closed, Christianity encompassed a wide spectrum of interpretations, some radically different from what would eventually become Orthodox teaching. Today, the Gospel of Judas exists only in fragments. Nearly a third of the text remains illegible, lost to damage and decay. Yet what survives is enough to challenge our understanding of early Christianity and the figure whose name became synonymous with betrayal. But the discovery raised troubling questions. If this account of Judas existed in early Christianity, why was it so thoroughly suppressed? What threat did it pose to the emerging church? And why, even today, does the Vatican view this ancient text with such suspicion? To answer these questions, we must examine how the early church determined which Gospels would be considered the Word of God and which would be branded as dangerous heresy. The story of the forbidden gospel is not just about Judas, it's about who controlled the narrative of Christianity itself and the extraordinary lengths they went to silence alternative visions of their faith. We know the scene by heart, 13 men sharing a final meal, one of whom will soon betray his master with a kiss. For centuries, artists have portrayed Judas Iscariot with sinister features, often clutching his payment of silver, separated from the other disciples. The image of Judas as the ultimate traitor is woven into the very fabric of Western culture, but the Gospel of Judas presents a radically different scene, one that would have been unrecognizable to most Christians throughout history. In this alternative account, Jesus pulls Judas aside, away from the other disciples. Far from condemning him, Jesus speaks to Judas with particular intimacy, sharing secrets he withholds from the others. "Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal." According to this forbidden gospel, Judas didn't betray Jesus out of greed or weakness. Instead, he made the ultimate sacrifice, his own reputation and salvation, because Jesus himself requested it. What's revolutionary about this text is how it completely inverts our understanding of Judas's role. In the canonical Gospels, Judas is portrayed as being possessed by Satan. But in the Gospel of Judas, he's the hero of the story, the only disciple who truly understands Jesus' message. The contrast could not be more stark. In the Gospel of John, Judas is described as having the devil enter into him. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says of his betrayer, "It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." But, to understand why this alternative portrayal of Judas was so threatening, we must delve into the theological worldview behind the gospel, a perspective known as Gnosticism. The Gospel of Judas emerges from a radically different understanding of Jesus. Salvation and the material world itself dot in Gnostic belief. The material world was not created by the true God, but by a lesser, flawed deity called the demiurge. The physical realm, including human bodies, was seen as a prison trapping divine sparks of the true God. Salvation came not through Christ's death atoning for sin, but through secret knowledge that allowed one to escape the material world. In this worldview, Jesus didn't come to save humanity from sin through his death and resurrection. He came as a revealer of secret knowledge that would allow those who understood to escape this corrupt, material world and return to the divine realm. The Gospel of Judas describes Jesus laughing at the disciples when they pray to their God, because they are unwittingly worshiping the demiurge, not the true God that Jesus represents. Why are you thinking in your hearts, "Your God who is within you and his powers, have I seen you doing that?" For Gnostics, Jesus' physical body was merely a vessel, a temporary disguise for his divine spirit. His crucifixion wasn't a tragedy, but a liberation, freeing his divine essence from material imprisonment. In this context, Judas's betrayal takes on an entirely different meaning. The Gospel of Judas presents a secret conversation where Jesus explains to Judas that by turning him over to the authorities, Judas will help liberate Jesus' spirit from his physical form. "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This is one of the most striking passages in the text. Jesus is telling Judas that the human body is just a garment, clothing his true divine nature. By helping to remove this garment through death, Judas isn't betraying Jesus. He's helping fulfill his mission. In this reading, the 30 pieces of silver weren't a payment gleefully accepted, but a burden sorrowfully borne, the price of Judas's own. Damnation and earthly memory, accepted out of obedience to his master's higher purpose. The Gospel of Judas wasn't an isolated text. It emerged from a diverse early Christian landscape where dozens of alternative Gospels circulated alongside what would eventually become the canonical four. These included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and many others, each presenting different aspects of Jesus' teachings, often with significant theological variations. The early Christian world was incredibly diverse. There wasn't just one Christianity. There were many Christianities competing for followers. Each had different understandings of who Jesus was, what salvation meant, and how believers should live. What makes the Gospel of Judas particularly provocative is its direct challenge to one of Christianity's most fundamental narratives. If Judas was acting on Jesus' instructions, then the entire concept of betrayal falls apart. Moreover, if Jesus wanted to die, indeed needed to die to fulfill his mission, then the crucifixion must be reinterpreted, not as a tragedy requiring atonement, but as a deliberate, necessary liberation from physical form, the text contains. Another shocking element, a clear attack on the apostolic church that was forming around the other disciples. In one passage, Jesus shows Judas a vision of the future. I have explained to you the mysteries of the kingdom, and I have taught you about the error of the stars, and I have sent it on high to the 12 eons. Jesus then tells Judas that the other disciples will curse your ascent to the holy generation. In other words, the very church that would condemn Judas was itself condemned by Jesus in this text. This isn't just a theological disagreement. It's a direct attack on the authority of the apostolic church. If Jesus himself condemned the other disciples and elevated Judas above them, what does that say about the church claiming authority through apostolic succession? The gospel goes further, presenting a vision where the disciples are seen leading people astray. Look, I have seen a great vision in which the 12 disciples are stoning me and persecuting me severely. And I also came to the place where I followed you. I saw a house, and my eyes could not comprehend its size. Great people were surrounding it, and that house had a roof of greenery, and in the middle of the house was a crowd. When Jesus explains this vision, he tells Judas that the disciples are offering sacrifices to Sackless, another name for the demiurge, the false god. In essence, the text accuses the mainstream church of worshiping a false deity. This vision directly challenges the legitimacy of the apostolic church. It suggests that the institutional church that was beginning to form was fundamentally misguided, serving not the true God, but a lesser, even evil deity. The portrayal of Judas as hero rather than villain wasn't merely a historical revision. It was a theological grenade thrown into the heart of Orthodox Christianity. It challenged the nature of salvation, the authority of the emerging church hierarchy, and the very identity of the God being worshipped. But what makes this text particularly remarkable is what it reveals about the man whose name would become synonymous with betrayal. In the Gospel of Judas, he is portrayed with a depth and complexity entirely absent from the canonical accounts. In this text, Judas is shown struggling with his role. He knows what Jesus is asking will condemn him in the eyes of the world. He accepts this burden not out of weakness, but out of profound strength and loyalty to his master's true mission. The Gospel describes Judas as being set apart from the other disciples. When he sees a vision of being stoned by the others, Jesus comforts him. You will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them. In the last days they will curse your ascent to the holy generation. This portrayal transforms Judas from a one-dimensional villain into a tragic hero, one who sacrifices his own salvation and reputation to fulfill a higher purpose. He becomes, in effect, the ultimate disciple, willing to be reviled throughout history out of obedience to Jesus' true will. What's fascinating is how this text inverts our understanding of loyalty and betrayal. In the traditional account, Judas betrays Jesus by turning him over to the authorities. In the Gospel of Judas, the other disciples betray Jesus by refusing to understand his true nature and mission. Judas alone remains faithful to the end. For the emerging Orthodox Church, such a radical reinterpretation couldn't be allowed to stand. It undermined too many foundational beliefs upon which their authority rested. If Judas was the hero, what did that make the church founded upon the authority of the other apostles? The Gospel of Judas presents not just an alternative history, but an alternative Christianity, one in which the physical crucifixion was not an atoning sacrifice, but a liberation from material bondage, where salvation came not through faith in Christ's death and resurrection, but through secret knowledge of cosmic truths, and where the true villain wasn't Judas, but the institutional church itself. This wasn't just an academic disagreement. For the early church fathers, texts like the Gospel of Judas represented an existential threat. If these alternative visions of Christianity had prevailed, the religion we know today would be unrecognizable. The story of Judas, traitor or hero, became a battleground for the very soul of Christianity. And as the Orthodox Church consolidated its power, it would move decisively to ensure that only one version of that story would survive. In the firelight, pages crackle and turn to ash. A dark-robed figure feeds another scroll to the flames. This scene played out countless times across the Roman Empire as Christianity transformed from persecuted sect to imperial power. The burning wasn't random destruction, it was calculated erasure, the systematic elimination of alternative Christian voices deemed dangerous by the emerging Orthodox Church. Among the texts consigned to the flames were numerous Gospels, epistles, and apocalypses that presented visions of Christianity at odds with the developing Orthodox position. The Gospel of Judas was just one casualty in this theological purge that would shape the future of Western civilization. The early church fathers didn't just disagree with these alternative texts, they feared them. These weren't seen as simply mistaken interpretations, but as actively dangerous, capable of leading souls to damnation. Their elimination was considered a spiritual necessity. By the late 2nd century, church leaders like Irenaeus of Lyon were working to establish clear boundaries between what they considered orthodox belief and the multiplicity of alternative Christianities flourishing throughout the Mediterranean world. In his influential work Against Heresies, Irenaeus explicitly attacked the Gospel of Judas. Others again declare that Cain derived his being from the power above, and acknowledge that Esau, Korah, the Sodomites, and all such persons are related to themselves. They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. By him all things, both earthly and heavenly, were thus thrown into confusion. They produce a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas. Irenaeus' condemnation is revealing. He connects the Gospel of Judas to a pattern of inverting traditional biblical villains, seeing in figures like Cain, Esau, and the Sodomites not sinners but enlightened individuals who understood deeper truths. This inversion threatened the moral framework the Orthodox Church was establishing. This wasn't just theological disagreement. The Church Fathers understood that whoever controlled the narrative controlled the faith itself. Alternative Gospels, like the Gospel of Judas, weren't just telling different stories, they were threatening the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. As Christianity moved from persecuted minority to imperial favor under Constantine, in the early 4th century, the Church gained secular power to enforce its definitions of orthodoxy. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Easter letter, which listed for the first time the exact 27 books that would constitute the New Testament canon. All other texts were to be rejected as apocryphal or heretical. The formation of the canon wasn't just about preserving authentic texts. It was about control, determining which versions of Christianity would be remembered and which would be forgotten. The Gospel of Judas, along with dozens of other alternative Christian texts, was systematically eliminated from monasteries, churches, and private collections. Possession of such texts could result in excommunication or worse. Many of these forbidden Gospels survived only because they were hidden away, buried in jars in the Egyptian desert or sealed in forgotten caves. The Church's fear of texts like the Gospel of Judas went beyond theological disagreement. These alternative Gospels challenged the hierarchical structure that was becoming central to Christian organization. If spiritual truth came through secret knowledge rather than church authority, what need was there for bishops, priests, and formal institutions? The Gnostic texts emphasized direct personal revelation. They suggested that true spiritual knowledge couldn't be mediated through institutions, but had to be experienced individually. For a church building its power on apostolic succession and institutional authority, this was intolerable. The Vatican's relationship with the Gospel of Judas spans nearly 2,000 years, from Irenaeus' early condemnation to the modern Vatican's cautious response to the text's rediscovery. When National Geographic announced the authentication and translation of the Gospel of Judas in 2006, the Vatican's response was measured but clear. Father Thomas Williams, Dean of Theology at Regina Apostolorum University in Rome, stated, "This is not going to change what the Church teaches. If you read the Gospels carefully, you'll find that Judas was not a bad guy who became a traitor. He was a traitor from the beginning." The modern Vatican's response to the Gospel of Judas was diplomatic but firm, acknowledging it as an interesting historical document while dismissing its theological significance. This continues a long tradition of the Church engaging with alternative texts primarily to reaffirm orthodox positions. The Church's fear of the Gospel of Judas and similar texts wasn't paranoia, it was recognition of their revolutionary potential. These alternative Gospels didn't merely add details to the Christian story, they fundamentally reimagined it. The Gospel of Judas challenged core church doctrines on multiple fronts. Its Gnostic cosmology with multiple divine beings and a flawed creator God contradicted the monotheism central to Orthodox Christianity. Its portrayal of the material world as inherently corrupt undermined the Church's sacramental system, which used physical elements like bread, wine, and water as vehicles of divine grace. Most dangerously, it suggested that salvation came not through Christ's sacrificial death and resurrection, but through secret knowledge available only to spiritual elites. For the Church, the Gospel of Judas wasn't just wrong, it was a complete inversion of Christian truth. Where Orthodox Christianity saw Christ's physical incarnation as affirming the goodness of creation, Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Judas saw the physical realm as a prison to escape. As the Church consolidated its power throughout late antiquity and the Middle Ages, it developed sophisticated mechanisms to suppress alternative Christian narratives. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, formalized the process of identifying and eliminating heretical ideas. Books were indexed, censored, and burned. Their authors sometimes suffered the same fate. Yet despite this systematic suppression, alternative Christian ideas proved remarkably resilient. Traces of Gnostic thought resurfaced repeatedly throughout European history, in medieval mystical movements, in Renaissance Hermeticism, and even in certain strands of Protestant thought that emphasized direct, personal revelation over ecclesiastical authority. The things we find in texts like the Gospel of Judas never completely disappeared from Christian thought. They went underground, resurfacing in different forms whenever the church's control weakened, or when individuals sought spiritual meaning outside institutional boundaries. The church's fear of texts like the Gospel of Judas reflected a deeper anxiety about the nature of religious truth itself. If multiple valid interpretations of Jesus' life and teachings could exist, how could any single institution claim exclusive authority? If Judas could be recast from villain to hero, what other foundational narratives might be questioned? The Gospel of Judas raised profound questions about how we know what we know about the past. If this alternative version of Judas existed in early Christianity, what other alternative histories were erased? Whose voices were silenced to create the seemingly unified narrative we inherited? The modern Vatican faces a different landscape than its ancient predecessors. In an age of information, suppression is no longer a viable strategy. Instead, the Church has adopted a more nuanced approach, acknowledging the historical significance of texts like the Gospel of Judas, while firmly maintaining their theological irrelevance. When the Gospel of Judas was published in 2006, Cardinal Walter Casper, then president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, commented, "We welcome the availability of the text of the Gospel of Judas, which will provide an important source for understanding early Christianity. However, the text contains elements that are incompatible with the Christian faith. This represents a significant evolution in the Church's approach. Rather than denying or suppressing the text's existence, the Vatican now acknowledges it as a historical document while maintaining its theological boundaries. But for many scholars and spiritual seekers, the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas and similar texts represents something more profound, a chance to recover lost voices from Christianity's formative period, to glimpse the rich diversity of the early Christian movement before orthodoxy narrowed the acceptable range of belief. What's at stake isn't just how we understand one figure from the past. It's about recognizing that Christianity has always contained multiple, sometimes contradictory, voices. The version that survived and dominated wasn't inevitably the only or best one. It was the one backed by imperial power and institutional strength. Today, as scholars continue to translate and interpret the fragile pages of the Gospel of Judas, the text's significance extends beyond academic curiosity. It challenges us to reconsider how religious narratives are formed, whose voices get preserved, and how power shapes the stories that define our cultural inheritance. The Gospel of Judas survived centuries of attempted erasure to deliver its message to the modern world, that the line between betrayal and loyalty, between heresy and truth, has always been drawn by those with the power to control the narrative. In its survival, it testifies to the persistence of alternative voices, even in the face of history's most determined efforts to silence them. Perhaps the most important thing the Gospel of Judas teaches us isn't about the historical Judas at all. but about ourselves, about how we construct villains and heroes, how we determine truth, and how easily we forget that the histories we inherit are written by the victors. The limestone box discovered in the Egyptian desert didn't just contain an ancient manuscript. It held a challenge to the very way we understand history, truth, and the complex legacy of religious authority that continues to shape our world today. The Egyptian desert holds secrets. Beneath its shifting sands lie the forgotten remnants of ancient civilizations, sacred texts, and lost histories. For nearly 2 millennia, this unforgiving landscape guarded one of Christianity's most controversial documents, the Gospel of Judas, a text the Orthodox Church had tried desperately to erase from memory. We know from Bishop Irenaeus that the Gospel of Judas circulated among Gnostic Christian communities in the late 2nd century. But after its condemnation as heresy, the text vanished from historical records. No copies were preserved in the great libraries of medieval Europe. No quotes appeared in theological debates. The voice of Judas had been silenced, his alternative gospel seemingly lost forever. How did this forbidden text survive when so many others perished? The answer lies in the preservation practices of an ancient Gnostic community and the peculiar climate of Upper Egypt, where extreme aridity creates perfect conditions for preserving fragile papyrus and leather. Sometime around the year 280 CE, as Roman persecution of Christians intensified, a group of Gnostic believers near the Egyptian town of Carrara gathered their sacred texts. These included not only the Gospel of Judas, but also the letter of Peter to Philip, the first apocalypse of James, and a text scholars now call the Book of Allegenes. With imperial authorities and Orthodox bishops actively hunting such heretical works, these sacred writings were too dangerous to keep, but too precious to destroy. These Gnostic communities faced impossible choices. Imperial edicts under Diocletian ordered the burning of Christian scriptures, while Orthodox bishops were equally determined to eliminate texts they considered heretical. Burial was their solution, a way to preserve their sacred literature for future generations. The texts were carefully copied in Coptic, the everyday language of Egyptian Christians, bound together in a codex with leather covers and placed inside a limestone box. This box was then sealed and buried in the Jebel Carrara caves, hidden away from the eyes of persecutors, preserved in the arid embrace of the desert. For 17 centuries the gospel lay forgotten. Empires rose and fell. Christianity transformed from persecuted sect to imperial power to global religion. The condemnation of Judas hardened into unquestioned truth. And all the while, his alternative story waited silently beneath the sand. The limestone box might have remained hidden forever, if not for a chance discovery. In the late 1970s, local farmers digging for fertilizer near the caves of Alminya stumbled upon an ancient burial site. Among their findings was a sealed limestone container. Inside lay a small leather-bound codex, its pages blackened with age, written in a script the farmers could not read. The farmers had no idea of the historical significance of what they'd found. To them, it was simply an old book that might fetch a good price from dealers who sold antiquities to foreign collectors. They could never have imagined they'd discovered a text that would shake the foundations of traditional Christianity. Thus began the modern odyssey of the Gospel of Judas, a journey through shadow markets and international dealers, through damaged storage units and bank vaults, a saga of neglect and deterioration that nearly destroyed this precious historical artifact before scholars could decipher its contents. The manuscript first appeared on the International Antiquities Market in 1978, when the farmers sold it to a dealer in Cairo. From there, it passed through several hands, traveling to Europe where potential buyers examined it but balked at the asking price of $3 million. Without proper conservation, the fragile codex began to deteriorate rapidly, its pages crumbling, its ancient ink fading. The irony is heartbreaking. This text survived Roman persecution, the systematic destruction of heretical works, and 17 centuries buried in the desert, only to face destruction through mishandling and neglect in our modern era. By 1982, the manuscript had made its way to Geneva, Switzerland, where it was placed in a bank vault while its owner continued seeking buyers. It would remain there for 16 years, slowly disintegrating in its unsuitable storage conditions. When it was finally removed in 1998, horrified experts discovered that the manuscript had broken into numerous fragments. Nearly a fifth of the text had been lost to decay, and many pages had crumbled into confetti-like pieces. The codex continued its troubled journey, passing through New York before being purchased by antiquities dealer Friede Nussberger Chacos. In 2000, when she realized the manuscript's deteriorating condition, Nussberger Chacos entrusted it to the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art in Basel, Switzerland, for conservation and translation. By the time experts began working with the text, they were dealing with a patient in critical condition. The manuscript had lost nearly 20% of its content through neglect and improper handling. It's a miracle that enough survived to reconstruct the text at all. The restoration process was painstaking. Conservators carefully pieced together hundreds of fragments, working under microscopes to reassemble the ancient jigsaw puzzle. Meanwhile, a team of scholars led by Professor Rodolphe Kasser of the University of Geneva began the laborious process of translating the Coptic text. In 2004, the National Geographic Society became involved, providing resources for the final stages of conservation and translation. Using advanced imaging techniques, scholars were able to recover text that had become nearly invisible to the naked eye. Carbon-14 dating confirmed what paleographic analysis had suggested. The codex dated to between 220 and 340 CE, making it one of the oldest surviving Christian manuscripts. The survival of this text is nothing short of miraculous. Not only did it escape the systematic destruction of heretical works in late antiquity, but it also survived its rediscovery and the subsequent damage from improper handling. If the manuscript had been found just a decade later, modern conservation techniques might have saved more of the text. When National Geographic announced the authentication and translation of the Gospel of Judas in April 2006, it created a global sensation. Front-page headlines declared the discovery of a lost gospel that portrayed Judas not as betrayer, but as hero. Television specials, books, and magazine articles brought this ancient text to worldwide attention. After 17 centuries of silence, the voice of Judas was finally being heard. Yet the journey from desert burial to modern publication came with significant ethical controversies. The manuscript had entered the antiquities market illegally, without proper archaeological documentation of its discovery site. This lack of provenance not only raised legal and ethical questions, but also deprived scholars of valuable contextual information that might have enhanced our understanding of the text. The story of the Gospel of Judas highlights the ongoing tension between archaeological ethics and the preservation of cultural heritage. While the text's publication has immensely enriched our understanding of early Christianity, its journey through the black market caused irreparable damage and loss of contextual information. The text that finally reached the public was incomplete, not only because of damage during its modern journey, but also because of deliberate editorial choices. When the Gospel of Judas was first published in 2006, certain passages were mistranslated in ways that emphasized a heroic portrayal of Judas. Subsequent scholarly work has revealed a more nuanced picture, where Judas remains a complex and ambiguous figure. The initial translations reinforced the sensational narrative that Judas was portrayed as a hero. Later scholarship has shown the text to be more ambiguous. This reminds us that translation is never neutral. It always involves interpretation, and those interpretations can shape how we understand ancient texts. Today, the restored codex containing the Gospel of Judas resides in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, returned to the country of its origin. Visitors can see the physical remains of this remarkable survival, the blackened pages that crossed 17 centuries to challenge our understanding of Christianity's formative period. But the physical journey of the manuscript is only one aspect of its remarkable story. As the text made its way from the Egyptian desert to the world stage, it created ripples that would reach all the way to the Vatican, forcing the modern church to confront an ancient voice it had once tried to silence. The burial of the Gospel of Judas wasn't just a physical act of preservation. It was an act of defiance against those who sought to limit Christianity to a single orthodox narrative. In some sense, those ancient Gnostics succeeded. Their voice has reached across time to challenge us today, forcing us to reconsider not just the story of Judas, but how religious authority determines which stories are remembered and which are forgotten. The journey of this fragile codex, from ancient scriptorium to desert cave, from black market to conservation laboratory, from scholarly obscurity to global headlines, mirrors the larger journey of alternative Christian voices throughout history. Suppressed but never entirely silenced, marginalized but persistently resurfacing, challenging us to recognize the diversity that has always existed within the Christian tradition. As we follow this remarkable text from its ancient burial to its modern resurrection, we must ask, what was it about this gospel that so frightened the early church? And how would the modern Vatican respond when confronted with this ghost from Christianity's contested past? April 6, 2006. In the Vatican's press office, phones ring incessantly. Journalists from around the world seek official comment on National Geographic's announcement of the Gospel of Judas translation. Inside the sacred walls, church officials gathered to formulate a response to a text their predecessors had condemned nearly 2 millennia earlier. The Vatican faced an unprecedented dilemma. In previous centuries, texts like the Gospel of Judas could be condemned, confiscated, and consigned to flames. But in the information age, suppression was no longer an option. The text was already public, already generating global headlines. already challenging the traditional narrative of Christianity's most notorious villain. How would the modern church respond to this ancient voice it had once tried to silence? The Vatican was caught between tradition and modernity. They couldn't simply dismiss or suppress the text as their predecessors might have done. In an age of information, transparency, and scholarly scrutiny, they needed a more nuanced approach that acknowledged the text's historical significance while maintaining their theological boundaries. The Vatican's initial response was measured, but clear. Father Thomas Williams, Dean of Theology at Regina Apostolorum University in Rome, stated, "This is not going to change what the Church teaches. If you read the Gospels carefully, you'll find that Judas was not a bad guy who became a traitor. He was a traitor from the beginning." This response reflected the Church's carefully calibrated strategy, acknowledged the text as a historical document while firmly rejecting its theological significance. Cardinal Walter Casper, then president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, expanded on this position. "We welcome the availability of the text of the Gospel of Judas, which will provide an important source for understanding early Christianity. However, the text contains elements that are incompatible with the Christian faith." Behind these public statements lay complex discussions within the Vatican about how to address a document that fundamentally challenged not just the story of Judas, but core elements of Catholic theology. The Gospel of Judas presented a radically different cosmology, with multiple divine beings and a flawed creator God. It portrayed the material world not as God's good creation, but as a prison for divine sparks. Most problematically, it suggested that salvation came not through Christ's sacrificial death and resurrection, but through secret knowledge available only to spiritual elites. For the Vatican, the Gospel of Judas wasn't just an alternative historical account. It represented a fundamentally different understanding of Christianity itself. The Church had to acknowledge the text's existence while firmly maintaining that it represented a theological dead end, a path early Christianity had rightly rejected. This balancing act revealed how dramatically the Church's approach to heterodox texts had evolved. In late antiquity, Bishop Irenaeus could simply condemn the Gospel of Judas as heresy. In the medieval period, such a text would have been confiscated and burned. Even in the early 20th century, the text might have been placed on the index of forbidden books, but by 2006, the Vatican had adopted a more sophisticated approach that separated historical acknowledgement from theological acceptance. Monsignor Walter Brand Muller, president of the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences, articulated this nuanced position. "We welcome this discovery as we welcome any discovery that helps us understand the historical context of early Christianity. But we must distinguish between historical interest and religious significance." The Vatican emphasized that the Gospel of Judas was written long after the canonical Gospels and could not be considered an authentic apostolic witness. Father Federico Lombardi, director of the Vatican Press Office, stated, "The Gospel of Judas dates from at least a century after the canonical Gospels. It represents the perspective of Gnostic groups that had already separated themselves from the mainstream of early Christianity." This emphasis on the text's late date allowed the Vatican to acknowledge its historical significance while dismissing its theological authority. Yet this approach carried its own risks. as scholars pointed out that many of the canonical texts also reached their final form decades after the events they described. The criterion of dating alone couldn't resolve questions of authentic witness. The Vatican's response highlighted the complex relationship between history and theology in Christianity. Unlike some religions, Christianity makes historical claims about actual events in time, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. When archaeological discoveries challenge traditional understandings of that history, the boundary between historical fact and theological interpretation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Behind closed doors, Vatican scholars grappled with more troubling questions. If the Gospel of Judas had been known to early church leaders and deliberately suppressed, what did this reveal about the formation of Christian orthodoxy? If multiple versions of Christianity had existed in the 2nd century, each with different understandings of Jesus' message, by what authority had one version triumphed over the others? These questions touched on sensitive issues of ecclesiastical authority. The Catholic Church bases its legitimacy partly on apostolic succession, the claim that its teachings have been faithfully transmitted from the apostles themselves. Texts like the Gospel of Judas suggested a Messiah historical reality, where diverse interpretations of Jesus' message competed for dominance, and the version that ultimately prevailed did so partly through the suppression of alternatives. For the Vatican, acknowledging the Gospel of Judas meant confronting uncomfortable questions about how Christian orthodoxy was formed. If early Christianity was as diverse as these alternative Gospels suggest, how can any modern church claim exclusive apostolic authority? This tension between historical scholarship and theological authority wasn't new. Since the Enlightenment, the Church had been navigating the challenges posed by historical critical approaches to Scripture. In the late 19th century, Pope Leo XIII had established a Pontifical Biblical Commission to ensure that Catholic biblical scholarship remained orthodox while engaging with modern methods. In 1943, Pope Pius XII's encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu encouraged Catholic scholars to use critical methods while maintaining doctrinal boundaries. The discovery of the Gospel of Judas intensified these tensions. Unlike earlier scholarly debates confined to academic circles, this ancient text had captured global attention. Millions who had never heard of Gnosticism were now encountering an alternative version of Christianity's foundational narrative. The Vatican couldn't simply ignore the text or dismiss it as academic speculation. Their solution was to incorporate the Gospel of Judas into a broader narrative about early Christian diversity, acknowledging its historical significance while maintaining that the Church had rightly rejected its theological perspective. In April 2006, the Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano published an editorial that contextualized the Gospel of Judas within the diverse landscape of early Christianity. The 2nd century saw a flowering of texts claiming apostolic authorship, but expressing views that departed significantly from the apostolic tradition. The Church Fathers identified these texts as expressing Gnostic ideas incompatible with the authentic Christian message. The Gospel of Judas belongs to this category of texts that the early Church recognized as departing from the apostolic faith. This approach allowed the Vatican to acknowledge historical complexity while maintaining theological clarity. Yes, Multiple versions of Christianity had existed in the early centuries. Yes, texts like the Gospel of Judas represented genuine attempts to understand Jesus' message. But no, not all interpretations were equally valid or authentic. The Vatican's response to the Gospel of Judas represented a significant evolution in how the Church engages with its complicated history. Rather than denying the existence of alternative Christian voices, the modern Church acknowledges them while still maintaining that the Orthodox tradition represents the authentic apostolic witness. Despite this careful positioning, the discovery of the Gospel of Judas created genuine discomfort within the Vatican. The text didn't just challenge the traditional portrayal of one biblical figure. It raised fundamental questions about how Christian truth was established and who had the authority to define orthodoxy. For ordinary Catholics, the sensational headlines about a lost gospel that portrayed Judas as hero rather than villain created confusion and concern. Parish priests found themselves fielding questions they weren't prepared to answer. Was the biblical account of Judas wrong? Had the Church been hiding alternative gospels? How could ordinary believers know which text to trust? The Vatican responded with an educational campaign aimed at both clergy and laity. The Pontifical Biblical Commission distributed materials explaining the historical context of Gnostic texts and why they had been rejected by the early Church. Catholic universities organized public lectures addressing the Gospel of Judas and its relationship to canonical texts. The Vatican recognized that simply dismissing the Gospel of Judas wasn't sufficient. They needed to educate Catholics about the diversity of early Christianity and why certain texts were included in the canon while others were excluded. This represented a more mature approach that treated believers as capable of understanding historical complexity. Yet beneath this educational response lay a deeper anxiety. The Gospel of Judas wasn't an isolated challenge, but part of a wave of archaeological discoveries that were complicating traditional narratives about Christian origins. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, had revealed dozens of previously unknown Gnostic texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls illuminated the Jewish context from which Christianity emerged. Each new discovery made it harder to maintain the image of a simple, unified early church that directly mirrored modern institutions. For Vatican officials committed to defending the Church's exclusive apostolic authority, these discoveries posed a genuine dilemma. Acknowledging historical complexity risked undermining the clear lines of authority upon which ecclesiastical power rested. Yet denying well-documented historical evidence would sacrifice the Church's intellectual credibility. The Vatican faced a fundamental tension between historical accuracy and theological authority. The Gospel of Judas and similar texts revealed that Christianity's early history was messier and more diverse than traditional accounts suggested. How could the Church acknowledge this complexity without undermining its claims to represent the authentic apostolic tradition? The solution, as articulated by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, was to distinguish between historical facts and their interpretation. In a 2006 address that indirectly addressed the Gospel of Judas controversy, Ratzinger acknowledged the diversity of early Christian texts while maintaining that the Church's magisterium had the authority to distinguish authentic apostolic tradition from inauthentic elaborations. What Cardinal Ratzinger proposed was a nuanced understanding of tradition, not as the mechanical transmission of fixed doctrines, but as a living process of discernment guided by the Holy Spirit. In this view, the early church's rejection of texts like the Gospel of Judas wasn't arbitrary suppression, but inspired discernment of authentic apostolic witness. This theological framework allowed the Vatican to acknowledge historical complexity, while maintaining its authority to interpret that history. Yes, alternative Christian voices had existed. Yes, multiple Gospels had circulated. But through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, the Church had correctly identified which texts authentically transmitted Jesus' message. Yet this sophisticated theological response couldn't entirely resolve the tension created by texts like the Gospel of Judas. If early Christianity was as diverse as archaeological evidence suggested, what justified the triumph of one interpretation over others? If multiple understandings of Jesus' message had existed from the beginning, how could any modern church claim exclusive apostolic authority? The Gospel of Judas didn't just challenge the traditional portrayal of one biblical figure. It raised fundamental questions about how we know what we know about Christianity's origins. For the Vatican, these questions touched on the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. As scholars continue to study and debate the Gospel of Judas, the Vatican maintains its careful balance, acknowledging the text's historical significance while rejecting its theological authority. This balanced approach reflects how dramatically the Church's engagement with heterodox texts has evolved, from the burning of books to the nuanced recognition of historical complexity. Yet beneath this evolution lies a persistent tension between historical inquiry and religious authority, between scholarly investigation and theological certainty. The Gospel of Judas, emerging from the Egyptian desert after 17 centuries of silence, continues to challenge not just how we understand one biblical figure, but how religious truth itself is established and maintained. In a brightly lit conference room at Harvard Divinity School, scholars gather around fragments of ancient text. Some wear clerical collars, others secular attire. Their animated debate echoes similar discussions occurring in universities, seminaries, and research institutions around the world. The subject of their intense focus, the Gospel of Judas and what it reveals about early Christianity. Since its publication in 2006, the Gospel of Judas has become a battleground in a larger war over historical truth, religious authority, and the nature of Christianity itself. The text has generated heated debates not just between secular scholars and religious authorities, but within both communities. What exactly does this ancient gospel tell us? Does it reveal a suppressed truth about Christianity's origins, or does it represent a dangerous distortion of Jesus' message? The Gospel of Judas has become a Rorschach test for how we approach religious history. Some see in it evidence of Christianity's rich diversity before orthodoxy narrowed the acceptable range of belief. Others view it as a heretical deviation rightly rejected by the early church. These perspectives often reveal as much about modern preoccupations as they do about ancient realities. The scholarly debate began with the text itself. When National Geographic first published the Gospel of Judas in 2006, their translation emphasized passages suggesting that Judas was portrayed heroically. Jesus supposedly told Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This translation supported the sensational narrative that the gospel completely inverted the traditional portrayal of Judas, transforming him from villain to hero. However, subsequent scholarly work challenged this interpretation. In 2007, April Decanick, professor of biblical studies at Rice University, published an article in the New York Times claiming that the National Geographic translation contained serious errors that skewed the Gospel's meaning, where the original translation had Jesus telling Judas, "You will exceed all of them." Decanick argued the correct translation was, "You will do worse than all the others." The translation controversy highlighted how interpretation shapes our understanding of ancient texts. Different translational choices could transform the Gospel of Judas from a text that elevated Judas to one that condemned him even more harshly than the canonical Gospels. This scholarly dispute wasn't merely academic. It touched on fundamental questions about how we access historical truth and who has the authority to interpret ancient texts. If professional scholars could disagree so profoundly about basic translation issues, what hope did ordinary people have of understanding the text's true significance? The debate expanded beyond translation to encompass larger questions about the Gospel's historical context and theological implications. Some scholars, like Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina, argued that the Gospel of Judas provided crucial evidence for the diversity of early Christianity before orthodoxy was established. This text gives us a window into the rich tapestry of early Christian belief. Before the formation of the canon and the establishment of orthodox doctrine, multiple interpretations of Jesus' message competed for acceptance. The Gospel of Judas represents one of these alternative Christianities that was ultimately suppressed by the emerging Orthodox Church. Other scholars like N.T. Wright, former Bishop of Durham and New Testament scholar, contended that the Gospel of Judas represented a later, derivative tradition that deliberately distorted Jesus' message. The Gospel of Judas comes from a time when Gnostic groups were deliberately recasting Christian narratives to fit their philosophical preconceptions. Far from representing an authentic early tradition, it reflects a second-century attempt to reinterpret Christianity through the lens of Platonic philosophy and cosmic dualism. Religious authorities entered the fray as well. Beyond the Vatican's measured response, Protestant denominations, Orthodox churches, and independent Christian scholars offered their perspectives. Conservative religious scholars emphasized the Gospel's late date and its disconnection from Palestinian Jewish context as evidence of its inauthenticity. Liberal religious thinkers saw in it an opportunity to recover marginalized voices from Christianity's formative period. The battle over the Gospel of Judas isn't just about one ancient text. It's about competing visions of Christianity itself. Is Christianity essentially the unified tradition represented by the canonical Gospels and Orthodox creeds? Or is it the diverse tapestry of interpretations that existed before powerful institutions narrowed the acceptable range of belief? This debate played out not just in scholarly journals, but in popular media. Television documentaries, magazine articles, and trade books brought the controversy to mainstream audiences. Dan Brown's best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code, though published before the Gospel of Judas translation, had already primed public interest in alternative Christian narratives and theories about church suppression of inconvenient truths. The result was a perfect storm of scholarly dispute, religious anxiety, and public fascination. The Gospel of Judas became a cultural lightning rod, attracting passionate arguments from all sides. For many outside traditional religious institutions, the text symbolized the recovery of suppressed knowledge and the challenge to ecclesiastical authority. For those within these institutions, it represented either a threat to be countered or an opportunity for more nuanced engagement with Christian history. What makes the Gospel of Judas controversy so fascinating is how it has exposed the fault lines in our approach to religious history. The same text can be seen as evidence of church suppression or as proof of the church's discernment, as the recovery of lost truth or as the resurrection of rightly rejected heresy. The battle over the Gospel of Judas also revealed deeper methodological divisions among scholars. Those trained in historical critical methods tended to place the text within its second-century context, seeing it as evidence of how some Gnostic groups reinterpreted Jesus' message through their philosophical lens. Scholars influenced by postmodern approaches were more likely to emphasize how power dynamics shaped which texts were preserved and which were suppressed, reading the Gospel of Judas as evidence of marginalized voices. These methodological differences reflected broader cultural divisions. In an increasingly polarized intellectual landscape, the Gospel of Judas became another battlefield in the culture wars. Conservative commentators saw the attention given to alternative gospels as an attack on traditional Christianity, while progressive voices celebrated the text as evidence for a more inclusive understanding of the Christian tradition. The Gospel of Judas debate reveals how deeply our approach to historical evidence is shaped by our prior commitments. The same fragmentary text can be read as confirming wildly different narratives about Christianity's origins and development. Yet, beyond these polarized positions, the scholarly engagement with the Gospel of Judas has produced more nuanced understandings that transcend simple binaries. Most serious scholars now recognize that early Christianity was neither the monolithic orthodoxy portrayed in traditional church histories nor the free-for-all of equally valid interpretations suggested by some popular accounts. Instead, the evidence points to a complex landscape where multiple interpretations of Jesus' message competed for acceptance, where boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy were initially fluid, and where the process of defining authentic Christian belief took centuries to unfold. In this more nuanced picture, texts like the Gospel of Judas provide valuable evidence for understanding the diversity of early Christianity without necessarily challenging the ultimate validity of the traditions that prevailed. The most valuable contribution of the Gospel of Judas may be how it has forced both scholars and religious communities to develop more sophisticated models for understanding Christianity's formative period, rather than simply asking whether that text is true or false. We can now ask more productive questions about what it reveals about the diversity of early Christian thought. The debate has also highlighted the complexity of determining historical truth when dealing with ancient religious texts. Unlike archaeological artifacts that can be dated through scientific methods, the meaning of texts depends on interpretation. And interpretation inevitably involves not just linguistic expertise, but philosophical, theological, and cultural frameworks that shape how we read. This interpretive complexity is magnified when dealing with fragmentary texts like the Gospel of Judas. With nearly a third of the manuscript damaged or lost, scholars must fill gaps and make educated guesses about context. These necessary interpretive moves create space for multiple readings, each influenced by the interpreter's background and presupposition. One of the humbling lessons of the Gospel of Judas controversy is how tentative our knowledge of the ancient past really is. When working with fragmentary texts from cultural contexts radically different from our own, absolute certainty is rarely possible. The best we can achieve is plausible reconstruction based on available evidence. As the scholarly debate has matured, some of the initial sensationalism has given way to more measured assessment. Few serious scholars now maintain that the Gospel of Judas represents an authentic first-century tradition that rivals the canonical Gospels in historical reliability. Most place it firmly in the 2nd century, seeing it as evidence not for what actually happened between Jesus and Judas, but for how some Gnostic communities reinterpreted the Christian narrative. At the same time, religious authorities have moved beyond simple dismissal to more nuanced engagement with what the text reveals about Christianity's diverse origins. The recognition that early Christianity encompassed multiple interpretations doesn't necessarily threaten established traditions, but can enrich our understanding of how those traditions developed through engagement with alternative perspectives. The battle over the Gospel of Judas may never produce a clear winner, but it has already enriched our understanding of Christianity's formative period. By forcing both scholars and religious communities to engage with evidence of early Christian diversity, it has contributed to more sophisticated models for understanding how religious traditions develop and change over time. For ordinary people trying to make sense of these scholarly debates, the Gospel of Judas controversy offers important lessons about how we approach claims of suppressed knowledge and alternative histories. Neither uncritical acceptance of sensational claims about church suppression nor dismissal of all challenges to traditional narratives allows us to engage honestly with the complexity of historical evidence. Instead, the Gospel of Judas invites us to develop a more nuanced approach that recognizes both the diversity of early Christianity and the processes through which certain interpretations gained acceptance while others were marginalized. It challenges us to distinguish between historically informed reconstruction and speculative reimagining, between evidence-based revision and ideologically driven reinterpretation. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from the Gospel of Judas controversy is how it reminds us that history is always more complex than our simplified narratives suggest. The early Christian landscape was neither the unified orthodoxy portrayed in traditional accounts, nor the arbitrary suppression of equally valid perspectives suggested by some revisionist approaches. As scholarly work on the Gospel of Judas continues, new discoveries and interpretations will undoubtedly emerge. The recent development of multispectral imaging techniques has already allowed scholars to recover text that was previously illegible. Ongoing work on the linguistic and cultural context of the Gospel continues to refine our understanding of its meaning and significance. But beyond these scholarly developments, the Gospel of Judas has already secured its place as a catalyst for rethinking how we approach religious history by forcing us to confront the diversity of early Christianity and the complex processes through which orthodoxy emerged. It has contributed to a more sophisticated understanding of how religious traditions develop and change over time. The battle for truth surrounding the Gospel of Judas may never produce definitive answers to all our questions, but it has already succeeded in challenging simplistic narratives and forcing both scholars and religious communities to engage more honestly with the complexity of Christianity's origins. The limestone box discovered in the Egyptian desert didn't just contain an ancient manuscript. It held a challenge to how we understand history, truth, and the complex legacy of religious authority that continues to shape our world today. In the ongoing battle for truth surrounding the Gospel of Judas, what matters most may not be which side wins, but how the debate itself transforms our understanding of Christianity's rich and complex history. In the silence of the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's magnificent ceiling, tourists and pilgrims alike search for one figure among the multitude. There, in the haunting masterpiece of the Last Judgment, they find him, Judas Iscariot, his face contorted in anguish as demons drag him toward hell. For centuries, this portrayal embodied Christianity's verdict on the betrayer, damned for all eternity, the embodiment of treachery itself. Yet without Judas, there would be no crucifixion. Without the crucifixion, no resurrection. Without resurrection, no Christianity. This paradox haunts the Christian tradition. The betrayer is simultaneously cursed and essential, villain and unwitting catalyst for salvation. In Judas, we find the shadow that gives definition to the light, the necessary darkness against which redemption shines more brightly. Judas occupies a unique position in Christian theology. He's the necessary villain, the essential betrayer. Without him, the central narrative of Christianity, Christ's sacrificial death and resurrection, couldn't unfold. Yet this necessity never translates into redemption for Judas himself. He remains forever condemned for an act that the narrative required. This theological tension surrounding Judas, simultaneously essential and condemned, reveals deeper paradoxes within. Christianity itself. How can a God who forgives enemies condemn one disciple to eternal infamy? How can divine omniscience coexist with human free will? If God knew Judas would betray Jesus, was Judas merely fulfilling a predetermined role rather than exercising moral choice? These questions have troubled theologians for centuries. Augustine wrestled with the problem of Judas's predestination in his writings on grace and free will. Medieval scholars debated whether Judas's remorse constituted true repentance. Modern theologians continue to explore whether Judas's condemnation can be reconciled with God's universal mercy. The Gospel of Judas enters this theological landscape like a lightning bolt, illuminating these ancient tensions from a radically different angle. By portraying Judas not as villain, but as Jesus' closest disciple, carrying out his master's explicit instructions, the text forces us to reconsider the nature of betrayal itself. What if the greatest betrayal in history was actually an act of profound obedience? What makes the Gospel of Judas so disturbing to traditional Christianity is not just its rehabilitation of one biblical villain, but its challenge to the very categories of faithfulness and betrayal. If Judas acted in obedience to Jesus' commands, then the entire moral framework of the betrayal narrative collapses. This collapse of familiar categories extends beyond Judas himself to encompass larger questions about spiritual authority and forbidden knowledge. In the Gnostic worldview that produced the Gospel of Judas, salvation came not through institutional channels, but through direct, personal revelation, the secret knowledge or gnosis that Jesus supposedly shared with his closest disciples. This emphasis on direct revelation posed a fundamental threat to emerging ecclesiastical structures. If true spiritual knowledge came through personal insight rather than institutional teaching, what need was there for bishops, priests, or church hierarchies? If Jesus had shared his deepest secrets with individual disciples like Judas, what authority did institutional churches have to determine orthodox belief? The Gospel of Judas doesn't just challenge the portrayal of one biblical figure. It challenges the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. By suggesting that true spiritual knowledge comes through direct revelation rather than institutional channels, it undermines the Church's claim to mediate between God and humanity. This tension between institutional authority and individual revelation remains unresolved in Christianity. The Protestant Reformation reasserted the primacy of individual conscience against ecclesiastical authority. Mystical traditions within both Catholicism and Protestantism emphasize direct, personal communion with the divine. Contemporary charismatic movements claim continuing revelations through prophecy and visions. Yet alongside these movements toward individual spiritual authority, institutional churches continue to claim the right to distinguish authentic revelation from dangerous delusion, true doctrine from heretical deviation. The shadow of Judas, simultaneously the closest disciple receiving special revelation and the condemned betrayer, embodies this unresolved tension. The Gospel of Judas forces us to confront another disturbing possibility. What if our villains are partially creations of our need for moral clarity? Human societies have always needed scapegoats, figures who embody evil and whose condemnation reinforces social boundaries. Judas has served this function in Christian culture for 2 millennia, his name becoming synonymous with treachery itself. The traditional portrayal of Judas satisfies our psychological need for clear moral categories. By condensing betrayal into one archetypal figure, we can distance ourselves from our own capacity for treachery. Judas becomes not just a historical figure, but a psychological necessity, the shadow we project outside ourselves to maintain our self-image as faithful disciples. The Gospel of Judas disrupts this comfortable projection by suggesting that the line between faithfulness and betrayal may be thinner than we imagine. If Judas acted out of obedience rather than treachery, we lose our archetypal villain. Without this clear boundary, we must confront the betrayer potentially lurking within each of us. This psychological discomfort helps explain the visceral reactions the Gospel of Judas continues to provoke. By challenging the betrayal of history's most infamous betrayer, it forces us to reconsider not just an ancient narrative, but our own moral self-understanding. If Judas was not the villain we've always assumed, what other moral certainties might dissolve under closer examination? Beyond these theological and psychological dimensions, Judas embodies a political paradox as well. Throughout history, powerful Institutions have needed both loyalty and betrayal. Loyalty to maintain cohesion, betrayal to identify enemies. The narrative of Judas as betrayer has served this dual function in Christian societies, simultaneously warning against disloyalty while identifying the boundaries of the community. The figure of Judas has performed crucial boundary-maintaining work in Christian societies by defining the ultimate outsider, the betrayer who can never be reintegrated. The Judas narrative helps establish who belongs within the community of the faithful and who remains forever beyond redemption. This boundary-maintaining function takes on darker dimensions when we consider how the Judas narrative has been weaponized throughout history. During medieval pogroms, Jews were collectively blamed for Judas's betrayal, his actions used to justify violence against entire communities. In political contexts, the label of Judas has been applied to dissidents, reformers, and whistleblowers, anyone who challenges institutional power. The Gospel of Judas invites us to consider how narratives of betrayal serve political functions, reinforcing power structures by demonizing those who challenge them. If Judas was actually following Jesus' instructions, what does this suggest about other so-called betrayers throughout history? Might some condemned as traitors actually be fulfilling deeper obligations to truth? This political dimension becomes particularly relevant when we consider the Vatican's historical response to the Gospel of Judas and similar texts. The early church didn't just disagree with these alternative visions of Christianity. It actively suppressed them, burning texts and condemning their adherents as heretics. This wasn't merely theological debate, but the exercise of institutional power to control the Christian narrative. The suppression of texts like the Gospel of Judas wasn't just about maintaining theological purity. It was about consolidating institutional authority. By controlling which versions of Christianity would be remembered and which would be forgotten, the early church established its exclusive right to define orthodox belief. The shadow of Judas thus extends beyond theology into the realms of politics, psychology, and institutional power. He stands at the intersection of competing narratives about betrayal and faithfulness, institutional authority and individual revelation, inclusion and exclusion. In his complex figure, we find not just a historical individual, but a symbol that continues to haunt our understanding of loyalty, truth, and power. Today, as scholars continue to debate the significance of the Gospel of Judas, the betrayer's shadow falls across these discussions. Some see in the text evidence of the diversity of early Christianity before orthodoxy narrowed the acceptable range of belief. Others view it as a heretical deviation rightly rejected by the Church. Both perspectives reveal as much about modern preoccupations as they do about ancient realities. Our continuing fascination with Judas, whether as archetypal villain or misunderstood hero, reveals our unresolved relationship with betrayal itself. We remain simultaneously drawn to and repelled by the betrayer, needing him as the dark background against which faithfulness becomes visible, while fearing the betrayer, potentially lurking within ourselves. This ambivalence is perhaps most powerfully captured in art. Throughout Christian history, artists have portrayed Judas with growing psychological complexity. In early Christian art, he appears as a simple villain, often smaller than the other disciples and lacking a halo. By the Renaissance, he has acquired greater psychological depth, his face reflecting inner conflict rather than simple malice. In Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, Judas is no longer separated from the other disciples, but seated among them, his face showing not gleeful treachery, but troubled humanity. In Rembrandt's sketches of Judas returning the silver, we see not a monster but a broken man, overcome with remorse for actions he cannot undo. These artistic portrayals suggest a growing recognition of Judas's essential humanity and the tragic dimensions of his role. Modern artistic interpretations have gone further, sometimes explicitly drawing on the Gospel of Judas to reimagine the betrayer as a complex, even sympathetic figure. In films like Jesus Christ Superstar and The Last Temptation of Christ, Judas becomes a tragic hero, struggling with his predetermined role in a cosmic drama. These portrayals suggest our evolving relationship with the betrayer, no longer simply condemned, but increasingly understood as a necessary, even sympathetic participant in Christianity's founding narrative. The artistic evolution of Judas, from one-dimensional villain to complex, tragic figure, reflects our growing awareness of the psychological and theological complexity of betrayal itself. As we recognize the betrayer's essential humanity, we confront uncomfortable truths about our own capacity for both faithfulness and treachery. This evolution parallels our changing relationship with knowledge itself. In an age of information, old boundaries between permitted and forbidden knowledge have broken down. Texts once suppressed are now freely available. Narratives once controlled by institutions are now open to reinterpretation. The Gospel of Judas emerged from the desert at precisely the moment when our relationship with authority, truth, and forbidden knowledge was undergoing radical transformation. Yet, as we navigate this new landscape of accessible knowledge and competing narratives, the shadow of the betrayer remains. Judas continues to embody the unresolved tensions within Christianity, between divine foreknowledge and human freedom, between mercy and justice, between institutional authority and individual conscience. His ambiguous figure reminds us that some paradoxes resist resolution, some tensions remain productive rather than destructive. Perhaps this is Judas's ultimate significance, not as villain or hero, but as the necessary embodiment of Christianity's central paradoxes. In his simultaneously cursed and essential role, he reminds us that faith often requires living within unresolved tensions rather than escaping them. The shadow he casts is not simply darkness, but the necessary contrast that gives definition. To light, the shadow of the betrayer will always fall across Christianity. Without Judas, the narrative of salvation lacks its necessary catalyst. Yet Christianity cannot fully redeem the very figure who makes redemption possible. In this unresolvable tension, we find not a logical contradiction, but a mystery at the heart of faith itself. As we continue to grapple with the significance of the Gospel of Judas and the figure it portrays, we confront not just an ancient text, but our own unresolved relationship with betrayal, authority, and forbidden knowledge. The shadow of Judas stretches across 2 millennia, touching not just theological debates, but the very way we understand truth, loyalty, and the boundaries between what is permitted and what remains forbidden. In a climate-controlled display case in Cairo's Coptic Museum rests a small, fragile codex. Its pages are blackened with age, its text barely visible to the naked eye. Few casual visitors pause before this unassuming artifact. Yet this humble manuscript, the Gospel of Judas, has defied 17 centuries of attempted erasure to deliver its message to the modern world. The survival of this text against overwhelming odds stands as testament to the resilience of suppressed voices and the persistence of alternative narratives. Despite systematic destruction of heretical works, despite centuries buried in the desert, despite decades of neglect in modern times, the Gospel of Judas refused to disappear. Like the figure it portrays, it has endured condemnation to play its essential role in a larger drama, challenging us to reconsider not just one biblical figure, but the very nature of religious truth and authority. There's something almost miraculous about the survival of the Gospel of Judas. By all reasonable odds, it should have perished, either through active destruction in late antiquity or through natural decay over the centuries. Its persistence against these odds suggests that some voices once spoken refuse to be silenced permanently. The rediscovery of this text in the modern era comes at a particularly significant moment in our relationship with authority, knowledge, and truth. We live in an age of information abundance, where texts once accessible only to scholarly elites are now available to anyone with an internet connection. Narratives once controlled by powerful institutions now compete with alternative perspectives. In the marketplace of ideas, the boundaries between orthodox and heretical, permitted and forbidden, have become increasingly porous in this context. The Gospel of Judas emerges not as an isolated historical curiosity, but as part of a broader reconsideration of how religious narratives are formed, whose voices are preserved, and how power shapes the stories that define our cultural inheritance. The text's journey from condemnation to global attention mirrors larger shifts in how we approach questions of religious authority and historical truth. The Gospel of Judas arrived in the public consciousness at precisely the moment when our culture was already questioning traditional sources of authority. Its alternative perspective on a foundational Christian narrative reinforced growing awareness that history is always more complex than our simplified stories suggest. For the Vatican and other religious institutions, the Gospel of Judas presents ongoing challenges that extend far beyond the rehabilitation of one biblical villain. By suggesting that early Christianity encompassed multiple, sometimes contradictory understandings of Jesus' message, the text undermines claims to exclusive apostolic authority. By portraying the institutional church as mistaken in its worship, it challenges ecclesiastical claims to spiritual discernment. These challenges cannot be resolved through the traditional methods of suppression that silenced alternative gospels in late antiquity. In an age of information, texts once condemned can no longer be confined to flames or buried in the desert. Religious authorities must now engage with these alternative voices, developing more sophisticated responses that acknowledge historical complexity while maintaining theological boundaries. The Vatican's response to the Gospel of Judas represents a significant evolution in how religious institutions engage with challenges to their authority. Rather than suppression, we see nuanced acknowledgement of historical complexity combined with clear theological positioning. This more sophisticated approach recognizes that in the information age, engagement is more effective than erasure. Yet, Despite this evolution, fundamental tensions remain unresolved. If early Christianity was as diverse as texts like the Gospel of Judas suggest, how can any modern church claim exclusive apostolic authority? If multiple understandings of Jesus' message existed from the beginning, by what criteria do we judge? Some authentic and others heretical? If the victors in ancient theological battles shaped the historical record through selective preservation, how can we recover the perspectives of those whose voices were silenced? These questions extend beyond academic debate to touch on how ordinary believers relate to religious authority and sacred texts. For many Christians, the discovery of alternative gospels has prompted deeper engagement with how the biblical canon was formed and how orthodoxy emerged from diversity. Rather than undermining faith, this engagement has often led to more nuanced, historically informed spiritual commitment. For many contemporary believers, engaging with texts like the Gospel of Judas doesn't threaten faith but enriches it. Understanding the diversity of early Christianity helps you appreciate the complex processes through which core doctrines emerged and developed. This historical awareness need not undermine belief, but can ground it in more sophisticated understanding. For others, however, these alternative gospels represent dangerous challenges to religious certainty. If the biblical narrative of Judas's betrayal might be questioned, what other foundational stories might prove less historically reliable than traditionally assumed? If the early church actively suppressed alternative perspectives, might other essential truths have been lost through the exercise of institutional power? These concerns help explain the sometimes heated responses to the Gospel of Judas and similar texts. What scholars might view as fascinating historical evidence, some believers experience as existential threat. The gospel that refuses to die continues to provoke reactions that reveal our deep investment in the stability of religious narratives and the authority structures they support. The passionate responses the Gospel of Judas continues to evoke reveal how deeply we remain invested in the stability of our founding narratives. When alternative perspectives challenge stories we've built our identities upon, the reaction isn't merely intellectual disagreement, but something closer to existential anxiety. Beyond these theological and ecclesiastical dimensions, the Gospel of Judas raises profound questions about how we determine historical truth when dealing with ancient religious texts. Unlike archaeological artifacts that can be dated through scientific methods, the meaning of text depends on interpretation, and interpretation inevitably involves not just linguistic expertise, but philosophical, theological, and cultural frameworks that shape how we read. This interpretive complexity is magnified when dealing with fragmentary texts like the Gospel of Judas. With nearly a third of the manuscript damaged or lost, scholars must fill gaps and make educated guesses about context. These necessary interpretive moves create space for multiple readings, each influenced by the interpreter's background and presupposition. One of the humbling lessons of the Gospel of Judas controversy is how tentative our knowledge of the ancient past really is. When working with fragmentary texts from cultural contexts radically different from our own, absolute certainty is rarely possible. The best we can achieve is plausible reconstruction based on available evidence. Yet this interpretive humility need not lead to relativism or despair about historical knowledge. Through careful attention to linguistic, historical, and cultural context, scholars can distinguish more plausible from less plausible readings, even while acknowledging the provisional nature of all historical reconstruction. The goal becomes not absolute certainty, but responsible, evidence-based interpretation that remains open to revision as new evidence emerges. This approach to ancient texts offers a model for engaging with complex questions of truth and interpretation in other domains as well. In a cultural moment often characterized by polarization and certainty, the scholarly engagement with texts like the Gospel of Judas demonstrates how we might approach contested questions with both rigorous critical thinking and appropriate humility about the limits of our knowledge. The scholarly debate surrounding the Gospel of Judas offers a valuable model for how we might approach contested questions in our polarized age. It demonstrates the possibility of rigorous, evidence-based inquiry that nevertheless acknowledges the limits of certainty and remains open to revision in light of new evidence. As scholars continue to study and debate the Gospel of Judas, new discoveries and interpretations will undoubtedly emerge. The recent development of multispectral imaging techniques has already allowed researchers to recover text that was previously illegible. Ongoing work on the linguistic and cultural context of the Gospel continues to refine our understanding of its meaning and significance. Yet, beyond these scholarly developments, the Gospel of Judas has already secured its place as a catalyst for rethinking how we approach religious history. By forcing us to confront the diversity of early Christianity and the complex processes through which orthodoxy emerged, it has contributed to a more sophisticated understanding of how religious traditions develop and change over time. The most significant contribution of the Gospel of Judas may be how it has complicated simplistic narratives about Christianity's origins. Rather than a straightforward transmission of fixed doctrines from Jesus to the apostles to the present, we now recognize the messy, complex processes through which diverse early interpretations gradually coalesced into what would become orthodox teaching. This more nuanced historical understanding need not undermine religious commitment. Many believers find that acknowledging the historical complexity of their tradition's development deepens rather than threatens their faith. Understanding the human processes through which divine revelation has been transmitted and interpreted can enhance appreciation for both the divine and human dimensions of religious tradition. For secular scholars and ordinary seekers alike, the Gospel of Judas offers a powerful reminder that history contains more voices than our traditional narratives preserve. Behind the accounts that survived lies a world of lost perspectives, suppressed interpretations, and forgotten possibilities. By recovering even fragments of these alternative voices, we enrich our understanding not just of the past, but of the diversity of human spiritual experience. The Gospel of Judas whispers to us across the centuries that history is always more complex than the stories we inherit. Behind the seemingly unified narratives of the victors lie multitudes of alternative perspectives that were marginalized, suppressed, or simply forgotten. By listening for these lost voices, we develop a more truthful relationship with our complicated past. This more truthful relationship with the past may be the Gospel's most enduring legacy. By refusing to remain buried, by persisting despite centuries of attempted erasure, The Gospel of Judas challenges us to question not just one biblical narrative, but how historical truth itself is established and maintained. It reminds us that behind every orthodox teaching lie alternatives that might have prevailed under different historical circumstances. This is not to suggest that all interpretations are equally valid, or that historical truth is merely a function of power. The early church had substantive theological reasons for rejecting Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Judas, seeing in them distortions of Jesus' message rather than authentic transmissions. Modern scholars have valid historical and textual grounds for dating these alternative Gospels later than the canonical texts and questioning their reliability as sources for Jesus' actual teachings. Yet acknowledging these valid reasons for the text's marginalization doesn't erase the significance of recovering its voice. Even if we conclude that the Gospel of Judas represents a later, derivative tradition, it still provides crucial evidence for the diversity of early Christianity and the complex processes through which orthodoxy emerged. Even if we reject its theological perspective, we can still learn from how it reinterprets the figure of Judas and the meaning of betrayal. The value of the Gospel of Judas doesn't depend on accepting its portrayal of Judas as historically accurate or its theology as valid. Even as a later reinterpretation of Christianity's founding narrative, it reveals how diverse early Christian communities wrestled with fundamental questions about salvation, divine purpose, and human responsibility. As the ancient text continues its journey into the 21st century, it speaks not just to scholars and religious authorities, but to anyone who has ever questioned received narratives or wondered about paths not taken. In its alternative portrayal of history's most notorious betrayer, it invites us to reconsider not just one biblical figure, but how we determine truth, establish authority, and relate to voices that challenge our familiar narratives. The Gospel of Judas ultimately confronts us with the persistent power of the written word to transcend attempts at suppression. Words once committed to papyrus can lie dormant for centuries, buried in desert caves or forgotten archives, only to re-emerge when historical circumstances allow their message to be heard again, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Suppressed texts can outlast the institutions that condemned them. This persistence should give pause to any institution that believes truth can be controlled through suppression. The Gospel of Judas demonstrates that alternative voices once spoken may be silenced temporarily, but rarely disappear permanently. In an age of information abundance, this lesson becomes even more relevant as texts once confined to scholarly archives now circulate globally with unprecedented speed. Perhaps the most profound message of the Gospel of Judas is about the futility of trying to control truth through suppression. Words once written tend to persist, finding their way back into human consciousness even after centuries of attempted erasure. In our digital age, this persistence of the written word takes on new significance, as information once released can never be fully recalled. The Gospel of Judas thus stands not just as a historical artifact, but as a symbol of the resilience of alternative perspectives and the ultimate impossibility of erasing inconvenient truths. Its journey from condemnation to global attention reminds us that history belongs not just to the victors, but to all whose voices persist. despite attempts to silence them. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable text and its significance, we return to the fragile pages resting in their climate-controlled display in Cairo. This humble manuscript, blackened with age and fragmentary and content, has traveled an extraordinary path from ancient scriptorium to modern museum. Along the way, it has challenged us to reconsider not just the figure of Judas, but how we understand history, truth, and the complex legacy of religious authority that continues to shape our world. The gospel that refused to die continues to speak, its whispered message echoing across centuries. No truth once spoken can ever be completely erased. The forbidden gospel endures, haunting theology, challenging faith, and reminding us of voices the Vatican once tried to silence. Voices that, despite everything, refuse to remain buried in the desert sands of history.